Hey everyone, welcome back, and today I have a brand new review for you. And this time we're taking a look at House of Ashes from the Dark Pictures Anthology, which are very excited to be back, and the curator is morbidly pleased to share yet another tale of terror with us. You may remember I reviewed Little Hope all the way back in 2020, and I've followed this anthology series with a lot of excitement, but also a lot of opinions, I have to say. So let's start with a quick synopsis. As always, I will avoid spoilers until towards the end, and I will also give you warnings before I drop any and tell you how to skip ahead so that you can avoid them. So quick synopsis, the game opens in a place called Ancient Akkad, which today we know as Iraq. A priest has been locked up inside a temple by the reigning king or emperor, who has also been executing a number of people at said temple. Now, at the same time, they're also preparing for an invasion by opposing forces who, oddly enough, aren't great fans of the king that keeps slaughtering people inside the temple. Something happens during the big fight, the priest escapes, and he teams up with a member of the king's army in order to flee into the catacombs because something monstrous is chasing them. The game then cuts to 2003 during the Iraq invasion by the US and Allied forces. A colonel has been asked to take over a small task force, which includes his wife, who's also having an affair. No spoilers there, that's literally the opening. And he has been tasked with locating Saddam Hussein's elusive weapons of mass destruction. Doesn't that take you back? Fun times. And they have discovered a strange silo underground, which they think is where they're being kept. So he takes the small team, including his wife, his wife's new boyfriend, and a few other soldiers to go and destroy the base, etc, etc. Unfortunately, as you can probably guess, because this is a horror game, that is not exactly what happens, and they end up unearthing this temple and getting trapped inside it, where they quickly realise they're not alone. The game, similar to previous iterations, plays with the idea of looking back at previous stories. You follow a man's diaries who was part of an archaeological expedition to the temple during the 20th century, and quickly also fell foul to the same monsters that you then discover. Now the game, like I said, plays with these elements of the Iraq invasion. It doesn't delve too much into the politics other than the sort of surface level racism, difficulty between Middle Eastern Iraqis and the US soldiers. One of the characters has 9/11 written on his hat and kind of goes into that very briefly at one point. But again, they're kind of sticking away from the politics, which, you know, works for the game, but I'm also one of those people who would maybe have liked to have seen a little bit more of it. Who knows? But anyway, this brings us to the first element of the game I want to discuss, which is characterization. Now, I agree with a lot of other reviewers on this, that the characterization in this game is much better, much stronger than the previous two games in the anthology. I don't tend to read other people's reviews before I make these videos because I like to try and keep it to myself and keep it my own thoughts, but I did actually for this one, mostly because I wanted to kind of see if I was just being mean because I loved Until Dawn so much, or whether people agreed with me. But no, this was something that people felt very strongly about, was actually the characterization in this game was much stronger. So as usual, you have 5 major characters plus a handful of reoccurring NPCs. Ashley Teasdale leads. Most of you will remember her as Sharpay from High School Musical, and she actually looks like her character in the game. The others, the graphics have been changed slightly for a lot of them. Of course, Pip Torrens returns as the curator. It's a fun time. Now the characters are a bit tropey, you know, the female character is referred to as Queen Bitch and doesn't particularly do a lot to try and subvert that narrative and that expectation placed upon her by the men that she's around. Nick is a jealous boyfriend with basically no other notable attributes. Eric is a gruff team leader who really loves his wife and his country, but also can get over thinking she's dead pretty quickly for plot forwarding reasons if necessary. Jason, who's the one who I mentioned who has a cap with 9/11 written on it, is a racist, sexist American lover who perhaps is the only one who really goes through a character narrative. And then there's Salim, who's actually a pretty cool dude with conflicts and a real drive other than just survival, which I think is a problem this game perhaps runs into, is that all of the characters go into survival mode, but there's no actual nuance to what they're doing a lot of the time. And there were a few times where I was thinking this was a little bit more kind of dull and they could have done more with it, kind of thing. They could have done more interesting things when all of these characters are thrown together, because when you throw an Iraqi soldier in with a load of US soldiers, there's a lot of built up tension there, and I just don't think they really explored it as well. But having said all of that, compared to the characters from Man of Medan and Little Hope, these are more fleshed out. They have more interpersonal relationships going on, which can get explored more thoroughly depending on how you play the game. And there were some definite moments in the game that have been shaped by your choices, which is something I perhaps didn't notice as much in Little Hope as I would have liked to. As I mentioned before, the curator is back in full swing, and he might be one of my favourite characters in gaming at the moment, reoccurring characters in gaming, because I just think he's such an interesting addition. However, it is getting a little bit samey, you know, he pops up maybe 3 or 4 times a game, says something cryptic, gives you a little smirk, does something a bit creepy, maybe offers you a bit of advice and then he buggers off again. And I almost wish they did a little bit more with him, like they did with Peter Stormare in Until Dawn as the psychiatrist, where aspects of the conversations that you have with him do then affect your game. Now, for the first time ever, actually, I noticed something really interesting while I was playing House of Ashes, and that's that the curator appears in the background at moments in the game where someone could potentially die, which is really interesting. I'd never noticed this before, and now that I've been on, dare I say it, Reddit and a couple of other spaces, people have actually been talking about the fact that he's there in all of the games doing this, which is just a really interesting little addition that I'd never noticed before and got really excited about, which shows the potential of these games. They are really good fun, and they have these really clever little moments popped in. Visually, the game is what we have come to expect, although this time they really got to play with that kind of claustrophobia. The temple is underground, you play maybe 20 minutes overall up above ground, maybe a bit longer than that depending on how you play, but basically the whole thing takes place inside this underground, crumbling, decrepit tomb. And so they really get to play with the fact that you often can't see what's coming. It also takes place using mainly just torchlight from flashlights, lighters, occasionally the odd flaming torch, so you really get this dim, creepy effect from the way that they have designed the game. My PS4 Plus occasionally struggled to keep up with the graphics. Occasionally it would cut to a loading screen in the middle of sections, kind of where a scene change would have been, or an angle cut would have been. It would pop a loading screen for maybe 4 or 5 seconds, which is a bit jarring, but I was willing to work with, and the graphics would occasionally have to update on screen as well, which is a bit distracting. But ultimately, it's a gorgeous game. The one thing I will maybe say that kind of altered the claustrophobia for me was the fact that they've got rid of the fixed camera point. Now that's something that you'll remember from Until Dawn and the previous 2 games in the Dark Anthology, is that you had most of the game where actually you barely controlled where the camera was. You kind of just shifted its position ever so slightly, which was really great for exploration and also was a really good way of keeping jump scares involved, because your sight could be blocked, but also they were controlling where you were looking at for the most part, which meant that you could have things jumping out in scenes or things swinging into scene, and they would have ultimate effect. So that's just a little change. I'm not quite sure why they included that change. I know fixed point camera isn't for everyone, so I can respect that, but for me personally, it was one of my favourite parts of the style of game. Another change I noticed is they have included a difficulty choice. Now, I mentioned in Little Hope that the QTEs had become too easy. I found myself basically never missing a QTE because of how easy they had made them compared to, say, Man of Medan, and also Until Dawn. Until Dawn got quite brutal at points. That was one of my complaints, so what they've now done is they've included a difficulty choice of 3 different settings, obviously going up in difficulty. Now, I played on medium and I found them to be pretty anxiety-inducing, particularly the button mashing moments. But there was also far too few of them this time, and I really noticed this, was that there were whole fight sequences where there were just no QTEs, and I don't know whether that was because they didn't want to have to code and design what would happen if you failed the QTE, but there were moments where I was kind of sitting on the edge of my seat waiting to have to press something or have to react, and instead I was kind of just watching a movie and not really playing an active part in the game, which is kind of why we play games and don't watch films, you know? Supermassive Games, kind of get in on that difference between film and video games, maybe? Ultimately, I am being pretty hard on Supermassive Games, I do recognise that, but that's because of how good Until Dawn was, and it came out so long ago, and it's just feels a bit like, even with these amazing devs, amazing actors, and so many other things going on, and the fact that they, you know, patented this type of game that was really cool and really terrifying, they still don't seem to be able to capture that terrifying experience again. Like I say, I'm being pretty cruel, I'm being very picky, I think, but that's just because I know that they can do this. But gosh darn if I don't love a game that accurately animates walking upstairs. It's my one thing in games I love, so they get all of the points for that. I also appreciate, finally, how this game goes back to Until Dawn's roots and doesn't explain away horror. This was a couple of the things people had criticism with for the previous two games in the anthology, is that although the games were creepy and although they were spooky, right at the end, everything gets explained away. In Man of Medan, it's that there's a gas leaking onto the boat that's causing them to hallucinate. And in Little Hope, it's a man having a breakdown and dealing with his demons by mapping them out on the place he used to live. That's fine, but that also kind of negates horror, because you're telling us that it doesn't exist, whereas one of the uneasy things that lingers with a person after watching or playing horror is the fact that it could be real. It's that could, and Until Dawn did that beautifully with the Wendigo. So I really liked the fact that this game went back to those roots. I'm not a great fan of the alien route, I will be honest. I kind of switched off a little bit when they started talking about aliens, because aliens is kind of almost like the middle ground between real horror, it was all a dream / hallucination. It's kind of that middle ground between it when you can go, the aliens did it. It's fine though, like I say, it was still a really creepy game. There was a couple of great jump scares that I loved. When Clarice went flying backwards at one point, I genuinely jumped out of my skin. And I just really hope that we're on an upward trajectory with the anthology, and that by the end of this series of 4, and certainly by the end of the second series, we're going to have something truly wonderful and horrifying.